Well, hello there, and hello. Welcome to RetroBlasting.
Hi.
It's Tuesday night.
Yes, it's Tuesday night, and 3 days ago, Melinda said we have to go live on Tuesday night about a specific incident. And I said, okay, what's that incident? And then she said, I'll explain it to you on the live stream. And I said, oh no. And so here we are.
I hope you're all ready with your pencil sharpened because we're going to be doing class tonight. We're going to learn a lot of things. We're going to go through a lot of things.
Before you go into those things, make sure everybody can hear you.
Hey, can you hear me?
Make sure you're closer to the microphone than other people. Your voice tends to ride that frequency.
Shout out in the chat if you can hear me. So yeah, we're going to be talking about some pop culture, modern pop culture, as well as old pop culture. Apparently they say we sound great, so we're good.
Good. Excellent.
Yeah, so let's just settle in for a nice little cup of live stream. Snuggle up with your favorite metal album and maybe
do not make this fresh air, okay? Don't do the fresh air.
It's gonna be something. Wow, Analog Toys, Tony, thank you so much. Super nice. It is awesome to see you again as well.
Awesome to see you, sir.
Thank you so much.
All right, so let's jump into this.
So as I'm sure pretty much all of you know, even if you don't watch the show, there's a show that's on Netflix, and it's called Stranger Things. Now, before anybody panics in either direction, we're not going to be talking about Stranger Things. So don't worry about spoilers. Don't worry about somebody bashing your show. Like, that's not what we're here to talk about. So that's just sort of what brought this whole thing up to the forefront. So I have put together some slides to help me stay on topic.
Don't call them slides.
I want to call them slides.
Call them visuals.
No, I want to call them slides.
Oh.
It's going to be my slideshow of going to Europe. No, I'm just kidding. It's going to be my slideshow of what we're talking about.
But you just said no spoilers, so there's no plot stuff in here.
There's no plot stuff in here at all.
Okay. We're not talking about the show. We're using it as a context for something else.
Yes.
Okay.
That's correct. So this is the only slide in the entire deck, the only audio-visual thing in the whole deck that has anything to do with this show. However, in the show this season, I think everyone knows, if they know anything about it, that there's this character named Eddie who it's rumored is named after the Iron Maiden mascot, Eddie. So great. You know, I don't really have any thoughts or feelings that I'm really looking to share about the character or the show or any of that. However, because this season, this character, Eddie, who is pictured here on the screen, is a metalhead, you know, he's billed in the discussions anyway as a metalhead. It's brought, and they play a very famous 1986 Metallica song called Master of Puppets in the show. And much like the whole Kate Bush Running Up That Hill extravaganza, where that song goes back into the pop culture like zeitgeist, Master of Puppets was suddenly like trending and whatever, because Stranger Things has that kind of power. So
let's do Sal's super chat real quick, and then just put a pin in that. Just want to make sure we get.
I've got some starred stuff.
Okay.
Wait. So I know, Tim Ward, if you're here, if you can also star any super chats that you see, that would be super helpful for me. Just because I'm going to be looking at slides. Thanks, Sal. I appreciate your support very much. I know you got my back.
All right. Sorry. Please continue.
Yeah. So I have asked our wonderful mod, Tim Ward, he's backstage, to pin your comments. So I will be taking breaks every now and then, and I will read those comments. Please just pin those super chats as well so that I don't miss anything. And I'll be doing those when we get to a nice stopping point. All right. So As you may or may not know, metalheads and metal fans, there is a distinction, we'll be getting to that, are, a little bit often accused of being elitists or gatekeepers or whatever. So Michael and I talk a lot about, this whole gatekeeping in fandom and gatekeeping with all of these kinds of properties and what it means to us as old school fans of things. And so I felt like it was, in this case, super useful to have a conversation about what that looks like. So first of all, I want to show you the controversy slide. So these are tweets that occurred. Someone tweeted out, "I'm sorry, Metallica, for all the fake Stranger Things fans. Love you." Okay. So then Metallica comes back and has all these tweets. So they say, "Don't be sorry. Everyone's welcome in the Metallica family. If they like puppets," which is the reference to the song, "chances are they'll find plenty of other songs to get into." And then they say, "FYI, everyone is welcome in the Metallica family, blah, blah, blah. Whether you've been a fan for 40 hours or 40 years, we all share a bond through music. All of you started at ground zero at one point in time." Okay. So that's just sort of then where all of these people start dogpiling on with opinions and doing YouTube videos about how crappy metalheads are because we gatekeep and we don't let new fans come in. And it probably sounds really familiar to you, right? Like,
yeah, it's a trend in a lot of fandoms these days. Just as a point of order, while I listened to hard rock and some metal growing up alongside all of the other stuff, everybody knows that I am not a metalhead from the 80s, nor am I steeped in a lot of this lore. So I'm going to be understanding a lot of this stuff along with you during this presentation. But to your point, or this stream, I should say, this set of visuals.
We can call it a class.
But to your point, Melinda, this idea of gatekeeping has been lamented much in the last 5 to 7 years across all these different fandoms: Star Wars, Star Trek, Doctor Who, pick it, Transformers, G.I. Joe, because you have these iterations that keep cropping up, and then you have new fans come in, and then the new fans start crying gatekeeping.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I'm familiar with it.
I see it, a message from Jeremy. I don't see it in the actual thing for me to pull it up on screen, but it says, "Can't stay long, but I hope you'll have a great stream." Thank you so much,
Thank you, Jeremy. Appreciate that.
Thank you for the super chat. Okay. So I wanted to sort of go through and talk about some ground rules of what we're going to talk about tonight. So tonight we're going to be talking about metalheads and metal fans and fans in general, not bands. So we're not here to debate bands. We're not here to talk about the history of different bands. That's a whole different topic. We're not talking about Stranger Things, like I said. So no spoilers. Not going to be getting into that. As a side note, anybody can be a fan of any band they want to be a fan of. I am not here to shame you or judge you for what kind of music you like. That's not what this is about either. We are specifically going to be looking at specific subcultures, a specific subculture in the US, so US only, during the 80s, because it was a very unique climate. We'll get into that. And we will discuss gatekeeping and when and why it occurs. So I just wanted to give a little bit of my credentials. These are all photos of me during the late 80s and just the tiniest bit of the 90s. As a Metallica, Megadeth, heavy metal fan, one of those is like a yearbook photo. So, I mean, I was very deeply entrenched in metal culture and metal music, and I wore the uniform everywhere I went. We'll talk about what that means if you're not familiar. The shirt I'm wearing right now is from that time period. So this shirt is from like the late 80s. So yeah, I just wanted to say I'm not just talking out of school. I lived through this. So this is definitely my experience. I also used a key source. It's by many people considered to be the definitive source of sociology research on the heavy metal subculture. It's a book by Dina Weinstein called Heavy Metal, the Music and Its Culture. It was published originally in 1991, and then she did a revised edition in 2000. So where she sort of talked about a little bit more about like the 90s impact and the Black Album and some of those things. Not that she really, again, goes into judginess or whatever about Metallica, whatever your thoughts are about Metallica. Anyway, just if you're interested in this, I highly recommend this book. It's like $10 as a Kindle book, and you can download it on Amazon. So, all right, so let's get into the history really quickly of heavy metal subculture. So, this is from the book. So she talks about how it grew out of the 60s youth culture. So that was made up of like disrespect for authority, hedonism, blue collar boys with like long hair doing drugs, like that whole 60s vibe, that aesthetic, right? And then in the late 60s, you had a combo of like two kind of huge events that were a little bit diametrically opposed. But when you combine them together, you get kind of the genesis of metalheads. So you've got Woodstock, which was sort of showing the hippie counterculture thing. Like they were very political, they were very against the establishment, they were against war particularly. And then you also had Altamont, which descended into like a macho display of violence with the Hells Angels and bikers and all of that. So you take those two things and kind of put them together, and you've got heavy metal culture. So, did I say something wrong?
No, I'm getting some water.
Just some water. Okay. The blue collar psychedelic music also started getting heavier. You had things like Blue Cheer and then later Black Sabbath. It's important to note, and she points this out in the book, that the subculture existed before heavy metal music as a distinctive genre erupted. So that's really important to understand, is that the subculture of metalheads, even though they weren't really called metalheads back then, was a group of people that had their own very concrete ideas and sense of community and culture. And so that's going to be really important as we go into what happens in the 80s. So another thing to note is that youth, the concept of youth and all of the trappings of youth, was co-opted into general leisure culture, and it became chic in the mid-60s for adults to start acting like youths. Now, prior to that, like in the 50s and stuff, like if you've seen pictures of like our parents, like if you're our age, like our parents and their parents for sure, once they hit like 30 or 40, they look like grandmas and grandpas. But in the 60s is when that all kind of started changing with the boomer generation, right? Because they were teenagers, and then like their parents started, the younger ones of them started co-opting some of their cool stuff. And so youth became detached from young people, and it pushed a lot of those people, like they didn't feel like they had their own identity, because you don't want to dress like your mom or your grandma, right? So you have to find your own different thing. That's part of being a kid, right? And so a lot of them started turning into like depression, drugs, suicide, cults, authoritarian sects, just to set themselves apart from the general culture, because a lot of kids just feel like, I don't belong in the mainstream. And then others formed subcultures that raised the symbolic stakes too high for the general leisure culture to easily co-opt them. So, bikers would be a really good example of that, because most people are not willing to go that far to be part of that. So that's we'll talk about that more later as well. So what is a subculture and what's like a counterculture? But I'm going to use the two terms kind of interchangeably, although there is a little bit of difference. But in this case, let's just go ahead and use the word subculture. It's kind of a counterculture too, but it's a cultural group within a larger culture that has beliefs and interests that are at odds with those of the larger culture. So it's not just, oh, I like this thing, right? It's, I have a whole lot of beliefs about how to act, how to be, that are not jiving with like what's.
If I could posit a parallel,
please, yes.
And then you tell me if I'm wrong. So from what you're telling me, a subculture of Star Wars fandom is anti-special edition original trilogy people.
Yeah.
Who don't go with the status quo of how Star Wars is presented these days. And they truly believe that, you know, a lot of that stuff is now anathema, if I pronounce that correctly,
You did.
Post 1997. In other words, once they started tinkering with the original mythology, everything that came after that is now very suspect. And so they tend to be more cloistered as a Star Wars subculture. They don't call them metalheads, they call them purists, OT purists, but they are a subculture within Star Wars fandom.
I would say it almost does approach a subculture anyway, because you've got things like purists of Star Wars especially really do start looking at all films a certain way, and they have a belief about, you know, like the ownership of art and all sorts of different things. It does go beyond just what you like and what you don't like, because if we're just talking about I like Star Wars or I don't like Star Wars, that's not a culture, that's just an interest.
Right, but this particular subculture gets a lot of flack from the broader fandom for being haters and for being elitist and for being all those things. You know, why don't you just turn your brain off, man? Don't think about it, just enjoy it, kind of stuff. Anyway, I'll be quiet.
Yeah. So subculture as a whole is more valued by the members than any of its parts. So for example, in this case with heavy metal, the music is the master emblem of the heavy metal culture, but it's not its meaning. So like I said before, the group existed before heavy metal even emerged. And so the group in and of itself is what people were really like wanting to be a part of. And then constant ridicule and exclusion by the mainstream increases group solidarity. And that's true of any group, but in this case, it really did help to solidify us as a group. You know, you didn't really have any alternatives. Like there's no one else who's going to hang out with you. So you could just sit friendless, or you could have like those two guys over there who like really get you and think like you and, you know, that kind of thing. So let's also talk about the environment of the 80s, because this is something that if you didn't live in the 80s, and this is not me trying to be a gatekeeper, this is just the march of time. So it's like, if you didn't live through Woodstock, you can watch documentaries about Woodstock and you can enjoy the idea of Woodstock, but you weren't there. So you're never really going to know what it felt like. And that's kind of how this is. So the 80s was this crazy time where all these things happened. So you had the Satanic Panic. These are all things that really influenced heavy metal and made it become what it was. So Satanic Panic, the PMRC, the Cold War and the arms race. So we were constantly thinking about nuclear war, and you see that imagery in tons of songs and artwork and things like that. Metallica talked about it. Megadeth talked about it. Lots of bands talked about it. The Just Say No section of the war on drugs. The war on drugs, of course, started with Richard Nixon here in the US, but way back in like, I think 71, but Nancy Reagan brought forth her whole Just Say No thing. And there were all these little, you know, groups that spun up around, you know, kids shouldn't do drugs. Drugs are bad, blah, blah, blah. We had the depletion of the rainforest and the ozone layer. So like all of this environmentalism was coming up. And there was a lot of cultural value that was placed on looking or being wealthy. So you had like the trends and the styles were very preppy, what we called preppy back then. It was about having these very like high-end looking shirts, and image was very important, and you know, looking like you would hang out at a country club was very desirable. And so metalheads took every single one of these things on this list and said, we are diametrically opposed to all of this. So every single one of those things we would get really mad about and argue and debate with you about it. And it was in the music, and it made us feel like we were at least mentally doing something, even though we didn't really feel like we had an outlet to do something, but we were talking about it. We were raising these ideas. All right, so let's see. I'm going to go to the starred section and just see if I can read some of these super chats because I don't want to get too far behind. So Bobby Collins says, how many megabytes of data on those floppy disks? None. They are coasters. But Brian Dillingham, thank you so much for the super chat. Sal, thanks a lot. We already talked about that one. Jason says, I'm not so metal. I'm actually made of a high density polymer. I get that reference. Strong opinions does not equal gatekeeping. Yes, that's true. They definitely do not. Jeremy says, we already read this one. So Matt says, time has changed the dynamic of all fandoms, including metal. Many age out, many find it anew. What's the issue? Well, we'll get to the issue in just a few minutes. So Odin says, I'll just say this. Master of Puppets is likely my favorite Metallica track of all time. I worship it. And all of a sudden, I'm tired of it. And in a weird way, all this popularity knocked it down. Well, that happens. Joel says, hey, Melinda, didn't we do a paper and a presentation about heavy metal subculture in college? Well, yes, we did, Joel. And if you remember, I stayed up till like 3 in the morning and then I fell asleep and I was late and you gave it by yourself. But yes, we did we were in anthropology together. That's a whole thing. Sorry, Joel. Yeah, it was one of those things where I'd stayed up so late getting all the clips and getting everything ready that I thought, it'll just be better if I don't go to sleep. And then I fell asleep. It was awful. Sergeant Slaughterhouse says, as a teen, my favorite Metallica shirt was often covered in the nosebleeds or splatter from busted lip that being a fan often got me. There was nothing cool about being a heavy metal fan, and I was very okay with that. You are 100% correct. So even though now people like to depict metal kids as cool guys, they were not cool guys. And if you guys, I don't know if any of you recognize the scenes that you'll sort of find throughout this presentation. I pulled stills from the movie Trick or Treat, which, while is a flawed movie, they really nail the whole where heavy metal guys were in the culture of school, like cafeterias, for example. Like, you were a loser and you were on the outside of like looking in, and you were not okay. Like, you were usually like the poor dumb kids who sit over there and you dress trashy and you're just considered losers. Like, that's who we were. So it's revisionist history to make us seem cool in any way. Although I think we were cool. Tim Hayes says, does anyone belong in the mainstream? I hate the word mainstream. It's stigmatizing. I think in this case, when I say mainstream, I mean all of the people that are socially acceptable, whatever that is. Like, so if you kind of put on, even if you're not in a clique, if you can put on a shirt and go out in public and people just kind of like don't notice you, and you're not like so objectionable for whatever reason that people make fun of you outwardly, then you're mainstream in this context. It doesn't mean that you feel like you belong. It's just that, you know. And then, yes, Sergeant Stryker says, I love that you used Trick or Treat. That's definitely a deep cut inside baseball with Skippy. Yeah, it is. And then, is this actually about how kids shouldn't like Metallica now? No. Like I said, like whoever you want. Last comment that I have here is, my parents burned my CDs in the barbecue during the Satanic Panic era. Master of Puppets was in that pile. So I'm sorry to hear that. That was sort of the fear that we all had as metalheads, for sure. All right, so going back to the presentation. Who were old school metalheads? So they were predominantly kids who were teenagers between 80 and 90, so primarily Gen X.
They were old.
Yeah, 1980 to 1990.
I know.
They also tended to be white, male, and lower middle class or middle class. And they had a full-time commitment to being a metalhead. If you were not full-time committed to being a metalhead, then most of us just sort of would see you as like, you're an okay guy, like you're fine, like we don't hate you or anything, but you're not like a metalhead. A metalhead is somebody who is always that. Like, you don't ever get to choose to be something else. And in my experience, it was also mostly people who, for whatever reason, were rejected by mainstream society. So we therefore rejected society right back. This is interpreted now as elitism, but it was actually based in anger and protectiveness. So if you feel like society is giving you the middle finger, then you give it right back and you go, fine, you know what? We're going to build a wall, and not politically, but like mentally, we're going to build a wall to keep you out. We don't want you over here. We're fine just being in our own little group, and it's better without you messing with us. So, for example, a lot of kids who are not rich or attractive enough to be preppy and may also have had unstable home situations, leading to like depression, suicidal tendencies, and drug use. Those, and then kids who struggled in school and had few support systems. Those were a lot of the people that I knew that was their situation, and to some degree, including myself. All right. So the uniform, you guys know probably what this looks like. They did a pretty decent job in Stranger Things of getting the uniform right overall. It was always blue jeans. You had a black t-shirt with a band logo. If you're a dude, especially, you can rip the sleeves off to show off your big arms if you've got them. Boots or athletic shoes. Like, it used to be boots in like the late 70s with like the Black Sabbath era, but then like once you get into the 80s, a lot of dudes wore sneakers or trainers. Certainly Dave Mustaine from Megadeth was big on tennis shoes. You could do motorcycle jacket or jean jacket, but you pretty much always had to have one or the other. Back patches on the jean jackets and buttons, pins, rings. This, that says tattoos, but like kids in high school did not have tattoos back then. Like now they do, but it was very rare to find people like our age in like the 7th or 8th grade that had tattoos. You just didn't, even if you were like that weird kid, like you didn't have tattoos in school. And then you had to have long hair. And the biggest thing about the reason why is that it was basically to like keep out weekend warriors. Now, bikers use that term all the time for like, executives who buy a Harley and then drive up to, Sturgis and try to act like they're part of the biker culture.
They trailer it up there and then take it out of the trailer and then ride around.
They like to like pretend and try on like they're a badass. And that right there is kind of part of like what we call posers. Like that's where that comes from. It's like, you're not living this every day of your life like we are, but you want to reap the benefits of like coming in here and, having the camaraderie. But to get the camaraderie, you have to like make all the sacrifices that we had to make. So that's just kind of part of it. So the rules: you always wear the uniform. If you're persecuted or bullied, then you're doing something right. And hopefully you get strong enough to just give it right back to people. There's no fraternizing with the enemy. So no preps and jocks. You're not going to sit with those people in the cafeteria at school. Like, you're not going to be friends with them and go like have, I don't know, go to the movies with them or go bowling with them. You're not going to do any of that stuff because they're the enemy. You don't tolerate bullying of anybody else. So like if there's the nerdy kid, right? Like nerds back in the 80s were a completely different social group than metalheads, but they were also outcasts. So like if you see as a metalhead some jock bullying a nerd, it's your obligation to like go up and say something to him and like get in his face. That's just kind of like bikers. Again, there's a lot of, and I'm not saying that we are bikers. I'm saying that some of the ideas there are very similar. You do stand up to authority. So if teachers, parents, church people, all of the people who were like coming down on us on all sides are coming at you, you give it right back to them. You always have your friends' backs, especially your fellow metalheads. And if, like I said, if religious or parents groups harass you, you give them the horns. And you always play it at 10. Like, you always play your music as loud as possible because you're making a statement with it. It's not just about enjoying the music. You're kind of like marking your territory. This is what's happening. So now I want to get into this whole elitism thing. There's always like, why are you guys so elitist? And so as a subculture, we were contrary to what mainstream America was all about, like I've said. So you had to be against those things in order to be part of the group. Like you had to actively go out there and put it out there that you were kind of against those things. So if you're able to blend in and be accepted by society, or if you're not standing up to any of that stuff, then we're going to have some amount of distrust in you. Why are you trying to come over here and be part of this group when you're not over here fighting the fight with us? Like, what's the deal? What are you wanting from us? What are you trying to pull? So metal as a subculture is not about a passive interest in a type of music. It is an all-in lifestyle and attitude as much as it is knowing and loving the music. And you really do need to know the music. Like you need to know the bands, and you need to know their name, the band members' names, and everything you can know about them. You have to spend a lot of time reading about it and study. It's like it's an all-in activity. And I saw somebody on Reddit, the pun is mightier, saying, we like being members of a special club and we think about our taste in music more than your average music connoisseur. So I think that's, with people constantly coming at you and saying, why do you like that trash? How can you listen to that crap? What's so great about heavy metal? Blah, blah, blah. You start to get really good at answering those questions, right? You think about it a lot. So posers, again, we've kind of already talked about this, but membership as a metalhead is always a problem because you're going to have these righteous full-time members like myself, and then you're going to have part-time adherents. So you're going to have those people who want to be weekend warriors, or who, for whatever reason, want to kind of dip their toe in, but not just dive all the way in. So anybody could go to a concert or dress in the uniform. Like nobody's going to probably do anything to you if you did, but metalheads can sniff that out. Like we have a sixth sense. You get really good at spotting clues about somebody. It's hard to even articulate it, but you know it when you see it. So you know a Bon Jovi fan or some other band that I'm not going to sit here and list all of them, but like there's a list of bands that like are suspect. Like if you have that on your shirt, it's like, who's this poser? So keeping out posers served to keep the true outsiders in and people just trying to look cool out. And it made it easier for you to be able to then go up to anybody who is in the uniform and know, hey, this person's like me. We have a shared value system. It's not going to be some guy who's going to look at me like I'm crazy for talking about whatever I'm talking about. Is any of this at all similar to like your experience as kind of a Star Wars or that kind of?
My short answer is, as you know, I never had the benefit of having a group to join because when I was of that age, Star Wars was dead. And because there was no internet, there was no way to connect with people. So it was an analog world, and I was never part of any real movement of any kind. So I never, my dad kept me in the Boy Scouts, but they didn't even want me there. So it was this whole, not my parents, but that's another story. Anyway, so yeah, I ended up never really being a joiner of anything.
So as somebody who wasn't a joiner, like, and please keep in mind, when I say a group, I don't mean like a group of people like that I was able to hang out with on a daily basis. It's more of a conceptual group. For me, it was. There weren't a lot of metalheads where I lived because I lived in the deep South. And let me tell you, that will make you be even more of a hardcore metalhead because everybody around you is very religious and very openly against the kind of music you want to listen to. And they were trying to stop us from listening to it. So there was a whole reason that we had to fight to listen to the music we wanted to listen to. It's even in so many of the lyrics. Like, go listen to a Manowar album and you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. So, I mean, does any of the the rationale of like sort of being in what people call elitist, or being, once you find anybody who's kind of a like mind, you kind of want to just keep like that, like where it's its own thing, walling off yourself into a little clubhouse and kind of going, okay, here's our clubhouse. Does it make sense to you, or does it
makes sense to me? It sounds really appealing. But I never had the privilege. I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean in a literal. I never had the opportunity. Yeah. I was always an army of one.
Yeah.
I was always on my own.
Yeah.
And I don't mean that in like some principled elitist way. I mean that in like this is the situation I always found myself in.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm sure plenty of you guys have similar experiences to that as well.
You got some super chats there.
Yeah. So, Joel, in response to like, he's my college friend who we did a project together. He says, "No need to apologize. As I recall, we still got an A. That was a really fun project. I'm recommending this stream to all my metal friends." Oh, well, thanks, Joel. Ben says, "I taught myself bass in secret from schoolmates because I didn't want to hear the piss taking." Yeah. Wicked Person says, in the late 80s, I started checking out old Alice Cooper, Black Sabbath, etc., looking for the appeals to Satanism my fundy parents warned me against, annoyed to find I had been lied to. I mean, there certainly was some satanic metal, but I mean, there may be a couple references in older Black Sabbath, definitely more in later Black Sabbath. Sergeant Stryker says, "Yep, I literally tick every one of those boxes when describing an old school metalhead. You perfectly described it. As a Gen Xer, I would include a latchkey kid whose parents were divorced." That's a really good point. A lot of us, probably not unique to metalheads, but certainly, like I was saying, an unstable home life definitely does weigh into that, because once you start feeling those feelings of like instability, depression, sadness, loneliness, all those things that you feel, because let's face it, being a kid is hard, and having socialization is a huge part of what you're supposed to be doing as a kid. So if you're not able to do that, then you feel sad and lonely and all those things. And so finding that other people in the world who you sort of think of look really cool felt the same way or feel the same way makes you feel so much less alone. Brushstroke says metal was your tribe. Yeah, absolutely. Ronan Medic says, "Correct, I lost many fights giving a little kid a chance to run." Absolutely. It's your absolute obligation. Sergeant Stryker says, "There was a code of conduct and somewhat a code of honor." Absolutely. King Eric says, "Is Kiss metal or glam rock?" Well, I would probably call them glam rock. They did have the Kiss Army, so some people would argue that that's like a whole subculture, but I don't know. I don't think there's a definitive right or wrong answer to that question. I mean, what do you consider Kiss? Do you consider them more glam, or not you, but King Eric, what do you consider them? I think that's the most important thing. Fat Rob says, "Hey, Melinda, I don't mean to sound like I'm calling you out, but I could have swore you mentioned you were a cheerleader while staying metal. I wonder what that was like for you socially." I was a cheerleader because my dad made me be a cheerleader. So in every picture of me as a cheerleader, I'm sitting there going like this. And even in my yearbook, my cheerleading coach wrote "smile more often" right above my picture at a game.
Oof.
Yeah, so that doesn't age well. Anyway, Sal says, "Speaking on band tees, I love that Tool has convinced hundreds of thousands of people to wear a shirt that says Tool on it. I do love that band, though." That is pretty smart, actually. Wildstar Studio says, "My valedictorian was a metalhead. The vice principal tried to revoke the title for not presenting the proper image, but failed." I 100% believe that. "She was awesome and nailed him to the wall in her graduation speech." Boy, I wish I had had that opportunity. Yeah. I had a teacher who called me out like the first time that, we had a test, and he saw my test results and he was handing them back out to the whole class. He handed me mine. He goes, "You're smart?" And I was like, "I guess." He was like, "Oh, I thought you were, I didn't know you were a nerd. I thought, and I was like, "I'm a cool nerd." And then I just left it at that. Daniel Dorian says, "Off topic, but seeing that LJN cat slayer behind Michael's right, jealous mate, jealous as F." And then Impossible Pie says, "Any other bands get sued beside Ozzy and Priest for their hidden messages in the music?" Yeah, I think somebody else did. It's not coming to me right off the top of my head. I'm sure other people in the comments know the answer to that. Taller Warrior says, "Everything that I'm hearing makes it sound like Stranger Things got it right." Well, again, I don't really want to talk about Stranger Things. I have my own opinions because I I'm not a huge fan of the show. I did scrub through season 4 so that I could better speak to what I'm talking about tonight, because I don't like to go on to a live stream not informed. So I've seen pretty much all the scenes with Eddie in them. And if we have time at the end, if you guys want me to, I will talk about my thoughts. But I don't want to talk about anything that could potentially be spoilers that didn't come out that long ago, and I don't want to be that person. So, all right. So now that we're caught up, let's move on. Subculture versus fandom. So this is a big thing for me. All right. So subcultures are not accepted by mainstream society, while fandom is not inherently controversial.
That's true. Yeah, that's true. Star Wars is not exactly Star Wars is not exactly esoteric. It's not exactly eccentric. It's not exactly out there.
No, but I would say that back in the 80s, if you were a kid or a teenager and you were still into it during the dark times, you could be mocked.
That would have been the late 80s and into the 90s.
Yeah, so yes. Exactly when I'm talking about, you could be mocked for it.
You could be mocked for it up until the point where it's like a classic car went in that phase where first it was a new car, then it was just an out of style car.
Mm-hmm.
Star Wars was out of style from like 85 to 90, 85 to 95, really. It was just out of style. So in that period, yes.
Now, did you ever get picked on for, like, did you wear Star Wars t-shirts? Were you outwardly like...
I didn't have any access to that stuff if they didn't sell it anymore.
Right. Okay.
And I was growing literally so that you own what you can.
You are quite tall.
Well, a point in saying that is just simply that it was all down to just literally carrying a torch, drawing in the margins of your notes X-Wing fighters and stuff when everybody else was like, why don't you just go watch like Batman? Like that.
Which you did, but it's not.
Yeah, but it didn't. But people were saying get into the new. Get into the now.
Yeah.
And in the 90s it was, why don't you go see Batman Forever? And it's like, I did. It sucked. I like The Empire Strikes Back. So, it's a whole thing.
So you can test the difference by the reaction of society. If you can declare your membership in the group without fear of being shunned, ridiculed, or feared, it's not a subculture. So metal subculture saw bands as members. Fandom sees them as icons to worship. So to us, back in the 80s, we saw, let me make our thing. We saw these guys as like, just guys, like we refer to them by their first names. Like friends of mine that I knew back in the day, if we're talking about metal and I mention the name Dave, they know I'm talking about Dave Mustaine, because like if I met Dave Mustaine, like putting aside how he is now, but like even if he was just like the coolest guy in the world, in my opinion, if I met him now and I've never met him before, I would just be like, hey man, it's great to meet you. Like as though he's like on my level. Like we didn't exalt them. Like we could sit there and talk about how amazing of a guitarist somebody was or how talented they were, but they were us, which is why we really, took things personally, very much so, when these bands decided to do things that felt like a betrayal. And, that's something that, again, I don't really see expressed that often in fandom. I'm not, 15 years old anymore, so I can't speak to how a 15-year-old feels right now, but that was a big part of it, was these guys felt like us. They felt like they were coming from the same place as us, and they represented like what it was like to feel hopeless and outsider and all that stuff. And then metal fandom adopted many of the subculture's norms, but they are not the same group. So my argument, as we continue on in this presentation, is that at a certain point, it switches. It's no longer a subculture. It becomes fandom. So fandom's not the same thing. It pulls a lot from the traditions of the subculture, but there is no community anymore to be a part of. and there's no way to keep people out of it because it doesn't exist. So what happened in 1991? Let's talk about 1991. So Metallica's Black Album debuted in mid-August at the number one as the number one in 10 countries, selling 650,000 units in the US during its first week, and it brought Metallica and metal mainstream attention. It has been certified 16 times platinum in the US, which makes it the 25th best-selling album in the country. So that's pretty big, right? That's not an outsider status thing. That is very, 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 very mainstream. So a few months after that, Nirvana Smells Like Teen Spirit hit big and became huge by the end of the year, ushering in the decade of grunge. Also, the Cold War ended in December of that year. Satanic Panic died somewhere between 92 and 95. There was no one thing that caused it to end, but it just sort of drifted away. And because of these things and a number of other smaller things, the core metal subculture really ended, I would say in 91, but certainly in the early 90s. And it was replaced, this is my opinion, it was replaced by metal fandom, which is a much broader group. So you have much more diversity of bands. You have the ability, because of that, for bands to experiment with inclusion of rap and other types of popular music infusions. And, you know, I'm not saying that's good, bad, or otherwise. I'm just saying that's what happened. Metal was not something that people were aghast that you were listening to anymore. It was on the radio. It was very, very, very common. And Metallica was and is and has been for 30 years an extremely mainstream band. Like, I can't express enough how mainstream they are. They were, again, I don't like them, but even if I did like them, that is just a statement of fact. Like, it's not controversial. I don't think it is. I'm sure someone will get mad because it's fandom, and fandom loves to get mad about stuff.
Yes, that's their default position.
So I put a picture in here of Star Wars pop vinyls just for you, dear, but appropriation. So identifying subcultures can be difficult. And this is a quote from the book that I was talking about earlier, because their style and particularly their clothing and music are easily adopted by the mass culture for commercial purposes. Businesses often seek to capitalize on the subversive allure of a subculture to sell products. And this process of cultural appropriation may often result in the death or evolution of the subculture. And so, not to say it's all Metallica's fault for doing the Black Album, because it isn't. A number of, like, some of them social, political things changed. Like, the world went from being very siloed, like it was in the 80s, to being more inclusive, which I think overall is probably good. Like, that's probably a good thing. But what that meant was that the culture really just couldn't exist. So it just sort of broke the back of that cohesion that we had as a group, because we didn't have anything to really stand against anymore. Everything was just muddy and gray. And, you know, postmodernism was coming in, and in the 90s, everything was like, oh, well, everything's an opinion and there is no one truth and all that kind of stuff. And so that really stands completely diametrically opposed to the way metal saw the world. So it kind of became a dinosaur and it died. All right. So the end of 80s metal culture, with the floodgates of the metal section of the music store open to the masses, the old metal culture began to die. And as the 90s wore on into the aughts, the social group silos that metal culture was built around began to crumble, and the subculture slowly faded into a fandom.
Especially with the internet.
Absolutely. That I didn't talk about that here because it's such a big topic, but yes, first the internet, and definitely then streaming music services, including all the way back to Napster. But certainly now when you get to Spotify years, like, it's, people have 400 different types of music in their playlists and they listen to all of it. And so they're not just a metalhead. Even metalheads that I know now are not just metalheads anymore, which, again, I think that's great. I listen to a ton more music than I did back then as well. So I'm not casting aspersions.
Well, back in the analog era, you had to be very selective with your music purchases because they were purchases on hard media. There was, you know what I mean? Like, so every time you spent those dollars, it was like when you were a little kid and you knew, I can ask my mom for another stormtrooper to have more than one, or I can get a figure I don't have yet.
Yeah.
But I'm only going to have maybe this one chance in the next 3 months.
Yeah.
So I better be very careful. And so music is the same way. When I go into that record store and I'm looking at the records and the cassettes, and then by the late 80s, the CDs, it's like, what am I going to get? Well, I'm not going to foray over into Kate Bush. And
then much like when you bought a video game,
right,
you're going to play that.
Yes.
A lot.
Even
if you don't love it, and you're going to know it really well. So like I had a bunch of tapes from bands that I was like, you know, you get it home and you listen to it and you listen to the whole thing.
Yes. The whole thing.
And you're like, oh, like you're not super thrilled with it, but so it became less possible to tell a metal fan from just some guy that works at a tattoo shop. Like you can't visually identify other metal fans. Even at a concert, like they may be metal fans, but are they a metal fan like you? Are they somebody who shares your worldview and belief systems? Like back in the 80s, you would have been able to go up to them and be like, hey, you know, whatever. Not really. Like that's certainly not my experience. So I saw somebody was like, died. Like, yeah, I feel like that part of it is gone. Like certainly the bands are still there and the fans are still there. And that part is thriving and alive and well. But
I've never understood it when people seem to think that a fandom of something has remained exactly the same for 40 years.
Yeah.
Like, because I sit back and I know I keep talking about the Star Wars thing, but it's the one analog I have for that long a time. And I just want to ask people with a straight face, like, tell me with a straight face that Star Wars fandom now, and I don't mean the quality of the people who are fans. I'm not trying to cast some sort of qualifying statement on anybody. What I'm simply saying is because of the internet, because of digital effects, because of the way corporations in Hollywood work now, because of the way movies are made and marketed, because of everything, all that water under the bridge with everything that's happened with just the franchise alone in the last 40 years, are you really gonna tell me that Star Wars fandom feels the same today as it did in 1981 when you were growing up? And similarly with metal, very similarly with metal, because the analog world made fandoms different. It did. And if you refuse to accept that, I don't know how to help you.
Well, yeah. And I mean, I'm not talking even about like every part of it because I mean, we've been talking for almost an hour. So I can't talk about every aspect. This is a huge topic. And believe it or not, there are people who are experts on this who write books about it and teach courses on it. So there's a lot there to unpack. But, you know, you're talking about the subculture, like trading tapes and making copies of tapes and making mixed versions of like really like off the wall like demo tapes and stuff out of the people would order out of the back of zines that were like photocopied somewhere and like you could barely read them, and you'd order them out of the back of like Thrash magazine, and you know it just there's like all of this stuff. And so having had that experience and even having heard of especially a really obscure band, because once you get into that part of it and it's like, you know, oh my God, have you heard of like Dayglow Abortions? Oh my God, have you heard of Impetigo? And like somebody actually has, you're like, you feel like you've won the freaking lottery. Like you've won the gold ticket, because like, it's not like you could go to anybody at school. Like, it's not like going up to somebody and going, hey, have you heard of Pantera? Yeah, I mean, you've heard of Pantera. Mm-hmm. So that's my point is like, yeah. So while some of us went deeper, so this kind of reflects back to what I was talking about earlier. Like some people went to extreme groups and joined like biker groups. So some of us metalheads, and this is what I did, went into like deeper extreme metal where, you know, the mainstream is most likely not going to follow you. So that's part of the reason why I love death metal so much, and like really obscure Swedish progressive death metal, for example. because it's not likely to ever be something that can be watered down to be mainstream popular, put on the radio, put into an episode of Stranger Things, and then have like everybody listening to it. You just kind of, you want to keep that little pie slice to yourself. And then when you meet that one rarefied person who knows who the hell Dan Swano is, you can go, you and me, man, we are definitely simpatico. Like just that alone. All right. But some people just switched over and became fans, just sort of more passive fans, and started listening to all the 90s metal, which I never liked. But a lot of people did. A lot of my friends did, and still listen to modern metal today, which I'm about as clueless about that as I am about pop. I don't really know a lot about modern metal. It's not my thing. I listen to a few bands here and there that people are like, you got to listen to this, blah, blah, blah. It's just not really my thing. But again, that's just my personal preference. So let's talk about gatekeeping.
Here we go.
All right. So gatekeeping, according to Google and the Oxford Dictionary, is the activity of controlling and usually limiting general access to something. Okay. According to Urban Dictionary, gatekeeping is when someone takes it upon themselves to decide who does or does not have access or rights to a community or identity. So I just want to say, metalheads, as the members of the 80s subculture referenced in Stranger Things, are not the same group as metal fandom that exists today. Like, I have a hard time finding other people who have had my life experience of being a metalhead in the 80s. Like, if I go to a metal show and I start chatting up various people, it's going to be maybe 10% of those people that are going to be like, yeah, I remember those days. I remember how it was back then. I know exactly what you're talking about. Most of the people that are in the metal scene today came in the 90s or after, and they just have a completely different worldview. Again, not trying to insult anyone. That's still like 30 years worth of being a fan of something. It's just that you don't have that experience. Fandom of any kind is broad and it conforms to no standards. So to the point that it's almost useless as a group identifier. So you can kind of study fandom, but it's much more of a commercial exercise as opposed to a subculture, which has intrinsic culture and beliefs and, those kinds of things.
What I don't understand is how this gatekeeping term has become so overused lately, when both definitions are about preventing access to a thing.
Well, yes, and let's talk about that.
Because there's no access that's being prevented to anything.
Yeah, so I want to talk about why old school metalheads like myself are not gatekeeping. I can't speak for all metal fans, but for myself, we're literally not gatekeeping, and here's why. So there is no culture to gatekeep anymore. It's been dead for 30 years. In the 90s, like, I stopped identifying as a metalhead. I didn't call myself that. Not because I don't love and listen to metal, but because the community is gone. It doesn't exist. So it's just weird to call yourself that. Metallica in particular is very mainstream. The net worth of the band, like all the members together, is $1 billion, guys. Like, they are not edgy, like, outsider people. Like, anybody and everybody can and does listen to Metallica, and no one can stop you. And no one's trying to stop you. I think some people are trying to play the cool card. I think that's it. So old school metalheads see this whole debate as being very manufactured. I know I do, and a number of my friends that I have from back in the day are like, this is all, is Metallica coming out with a new album? Did they reach out to the people who are making Stranger Things and like organize this so that they could then come out and go, hey, don't try to gatekeep, to like try to get people to want to listen to them more? Like, it feels like that. It feels like a stunt. We don't understand what anyone's talking about. So We may not love that the masses appropriated our subculture, but it happened 30 years ago. So most of us have accepted it. We may not love it, but like it happened. And, they kind of like gate, what do you call it? Like when they charge the gate and then they just like break through the gate and like get in for free. That's what happened. The gate crashed our little club, our little subculture. Fandom, on the other hand, does love to assert itself as all-knowing in order to feel superior to someone else. So what you're seeing on the internet and online on all these like tweets and stuff like that is people trying to play the one-upmanship card, which fandom loves to do that. Subcultures, like, we never saw the need to do that because we just kind of felt comfortable in our metalness. Like if I'm sitting there and I'm fully, like everybody knows what I am and I know what I am, so I don't have to assert that by calling you whatever. Like, I don't know. No one can stop you from having access to metal music or from dressing up in the metal uniform for that matter. People who were bullied, though, and who suffered for being members of a subculture for many years are not obligated to confer onto new fans the same reverence that we give to others who lived through those times. So it doesn't mean that we want to prevent new fans from listening to metal, but it just means that like if you're new, you have to work your way up the chain of like having the cred of being even in a fandom. Like that's just how life works. And that's not unique to metal. That's true of anything. It's like if I'm suddenly like slightly interested in Transformers and I go over into a Transformers group and I'm like, hey, you guys all need to respect me because I like Optimus Prime and that's all I know, but I still deserve to be here. It's like, yeah, you can be here, but like we've been doing this for like 40 years. So maybe sit down and listen for a little while before you start talking.
Yeah, it's what Lio Convoy always says about people who they think they're really knowledgeable about animation simply because they like it, but they don't know animation styles, the names of the animators, the history behind certain shows.
And you don't have to like it.
Yeah.
But if you're going to walk into a room full of people who do know all that and assert very loudly that your interest in a thing is as valuable as their long-lived and hard-earned knowledge of the thing, it's not going to go over well,
and that's
guys.
what Lio always says when he encounters these individuals is he's like, look, you can like the thing all you want, but don't sit here and say to me that your feelings about a thing are as valuable or useful as our knowledge of this thing.
Right. I mean, we all can sit around and talk about, oh my God, this album's amazing, or oh my God, and I only know the old stuff, but if somebody were to ask me, like a brand new person who's 20 years old or 15 years old came up to me and was like, hey, I want to listen to one of the 80s Metallica albums. Which album should I pick? I would gladly explain the differences and say, here, here's sort of what do you like? And here, I'll help you pick the right one. And, that's cool that you're into it. And like, I'm not going to be like, you're new. You can't listen to this. Like, that's dumb. Like, no one's doing that. I mean, I guess some people may be doing that, but I don't know anybody who's doing that. And that includes in like Star Wars fandom as well.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we have a ton of friends who, regardless of their age, didn't watch Star Wars. We're not into Star Wars, but they go, well, which version of Star Wars should I start with? Or, what do you recommend? And that's just, yeah, we're all about it. All right. So you do not automatically gain social cachet in any group, club, or subculture by buying an album or t-shirt. You are welcome, but you have to put in the time to earn the respect. Being allowed in and being instantly respected as a senior member are not the same thing. So that's not unique to metal. That's just the way human society works.
Right. In most structures.
In pretty much all structures. Like, it would be like you walking in as a freshman and demanding to be a senior and demanding to have all the rights and privileges of a senior. And all the seniors are going to look at you like, who the hell are you? Why are you so special? That's just, people who've put in the work. It's like cutting in line, We've been standing in the line for 4 hours and you just think you're going to cut to the front because why? if you're mad that you're not considered part of our subculture because of your age, then you'd have to just blame luck or the passage of time. And if you weren't alive when something happens, then you just can't go to the party. So I don't really know if that's what people are trying to say. Like they want to be able to get all of the clout or the cred, as though, but there are people who've been doing, like, some people have been into metal and stayed in metal like way after I tapped out of at least mainstream metal, and they know a ton more than I do. Like Sam Dunn is a really great example who, his documentary Headbanger, a Headbanger's Journey, Metal, a Headbanger's Journey. Great documentary. He's an anthropologist like myself. We have a lot in common, but he has stayed very relevant in the metal scene and has like lots of videos and documentaries that he's made. I give him all the props. Like he knows a lot more about that than I do. And that doesn't make me less. That's just like kudos to him. So the question comes back to, but metalheads are calling new Metallica fans fake, because that's what's in this tweet. So after everything we've talked about, I would hope that you kind of have a little bit more of an understanding of why that might be happening. But I also want to call something out. So can we look at this tweet? And can we look at like the name of the person who tweeted it? Their name is Nirvana is God Tier 3. So I don't know if I have to point out why that's ironic, but that person, to an old school metalhead, the first word out of our mouths would be poser. So you're saying somebody else is a fake fan, but we would say you're a fake fan. So you don't speak for any of us. So just be quiet. So now that I've kind of gone through all of that, I want to know, Michael, what
me? Yes.
Yeah. What your thoughts are on gatekeeping and fandom versus, keeping people out, keeping people in.
I think what it boils down to is, for me, is this baffling unwillingness to acknowledge the things we can't change when we come into a fandom or an interest. And it's almost that whole, it's akin to that whole power fantasy of, I'm going to show up fully formed and badass with all my superpowers. My hero had no journey. My hero showed up awesome. And it's like, that's not ever a good story, right? That's never. No. So for example, if we take it out of the Star Wars realm for a minute, I really am interested in World War II. Mm-hmm. I literally wasn't alive.
Right.
I can never be, nor would I ever attempt to insinuate that I have some idea of what it was like to be there. My father can't even make that claim because he wasn't alive either. I went up in a Spitfire for an hour. I now know something of what it's like to be in that airplane.
Right.
But hardly in combat, hardly, under duress, sure. Hardly every day, there's all these different stressors and things. And even down to things like, I literally didn't breathe that air. I don't even know how they made cheese back then. I don't think I've ever had cheese wrapped in cheesecloth. Literally, those are things, and they all compound into me acknowledging, yeah, I can be interested in World War II. I can be very knowledgeable about it. I can have a healthy respect for it. But it's okay to acknowledge that I wasn't there either. So there will never be firsthand experience with that time period.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
I can touch a Spitfire that was in the war.
Mm-hmm.
I can sit in it. I can fly in it. But I'll never know it in combat in 1940. I'll never know what it was. You see what I'm saying?
I do.
Yeah. So with Star Wars or Metallica, or metal, I should say, sorry, metal. There are an inordinate number of people who seem insecure about acknowledging things they can't help. They don't want to acknowledge, I wasn't there then. And that's okay. It's also okay to not know things. Am I making sense, or am
You
I
are
totally
making
off
sense.
base?
No, yeah.
So like, when people get all angry, about the fact that they'll sit there and they'll say things like, Ewan McGregor is a better Obi-Wan Kenobi than Alec Guinness ever was. And then I will ask them, well, by what measuring stick? Because what other movies of Alec Guinness's have you seen? And they're like, I don't watch old movies. I don't care about movies. I just like Star Wars. And then you go, but then they'll fight you on it. Like, they'll fight you on it. And it's like, I really think there's a knowledge gap here.
Yeah.
And it's not a knowledge gap to try and change your mind. You can think Ewan McGregor is your preferred character in the movie or preferred actor,
right,
or whatever. That's fine. But refusing to acknowledge the work of the other performer, refusing to study it, refusing to look into it, that to me is the problem. And it gets back to that whole thing of, I don't want to have to do the work. I just want to show up with a red cape and be invincible. And it's like, it doesn't work that way. Life isn't a comic book. I hate to break it to you.
I feel like for some people it is. Like, I don't know. All right, so some chats that got starred. Peter Vinkman says, Melinda, did Metallica cease being part of the group after the Justice album? Well, I think when they released the Black Album, it is much more radio friendly in a number of ways that I'm not going to go into heavily here. But there's a lot of that is not super debatable. It's, again, just statements of fact. They're shorter songs. They're less. They're not as heavy. They're much more produced. They have a completely different producer, Bob Rock. They intentionally were trying to tone down their sound so that they could get more radio play, because they had a very successful music video with one from the Justice album, and they liked the success. So I always sort of think of Metallica as like, remember Mean Girls? Lindsay Lohan shows up in school and she's the new girl, and she's initially friends with kind of like the dorks and the losers. And then she sees this opportunity to kind of like jump across the cliff and like be popular and be with the popular boy that she likes. That's what Metallica did. Like, they stood on our shoulder. Like, they were one of us. They were part of our, subculture. And they saw the opportunity, because of whatever, to become really famous and make a ton of money. And they wanted to do that. And so they did. And they did it at the expense of all of the rest of us, or a lot of us feel that way. And they brought in all of the masses and hordes of these jock assholes who had spent the last 10 years beating the crap out of us for listening to Metallica. And then those guys started walking around wearing Metallica shirts, and they still bullied us. So yeah, that felt like a betrayal. And people now want to say like, oh, don't talk about selling out, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, again, if you didn't live through that experience of having one of those jock assholes who literally dumped your books and kicked you down in the hallway, wear a Metallica shirt in front of you and talk about how brutal and cool it was, like, it's very mind-bending, because they're still jerks to you. And they never acknowledge that they made fun of you for listening to the same band they now listen to. It's Impossible Pie says, so did grunge kill hair bands and metal bands? Not by itself. I think it was one of many factors that would, metal was kind of already on the way out. And honestly, I think even the subculture was kind of starting to die out before 91 as well, but it got reinvigorated with the PMRC, because, again, that was a very overt and specific stressor that got placed on the subculture. And we all banded together and got enraged that this group of politicians were trying to legislate away our access to music. And so I think that's what gave us the last like 4 years or so of the subculture. But I kind of just think it was a perfect storm of like stuff that was happening in the world that made hair metal and heavy metal a thing, and those things all changed and went away, and so the subculture was going to end anyway. So I don't think it's just Metallica's fault, and I don't think it's just grunge's fault either. Peter Vinkman says, Melinda, you've mentioned in the past being a huge fan of Prince and Madonna. Well, not Madonna, but Prince. How did that sit with your metal friends in those days? Well, I was a fan of Prince when I was in the 3rd grade. I didn't discover metal until I was like in the 5th grade, 6th grade. So it didn't, I wasn't listening to Prince anymore when I was listening to metal. You have to you don't have to stop listening to everything else. I did still listen to a few random things every now and then, but in general, you immerse yourself in metal. KB says you can't talk about 90s metal without Pantera, by the way. I just have to point out, like, Pantera started out as a hair metal band, and, you know, we kind of all, like, think of them as, like glam hair metal. And so you should go, if you aren't, I mean, if you're a big Pantera fan, you probably already know this, but go look up Pantera's first album and, like, their hair. It'll blow your mind if you haven't seen it before. Wicked Person says, eventually we all got too old to decide who and what is edgy, cool, or extreme, or whatever anymore. Yeah, I mean, that's probably true. What's edgy now is going to be something totally different, because it's going to be based on what's going on in the world now, and it's kind of a young person's game. So I'm certainly not trying to be an arbiter of what's cool or edgy. But I do know what I lived through, so I'm only speaking to that. Trencher says, where I am, Metallica has been mainstream as long as I can remember, but it's an interesting discussion. Yeah, absolutely. And thank you very much for the super chat. Yeah, they've been mainstream for a long time. And I mean, some of the really hardcore early metal fans said that Master of Puppets album was them selling out, because, you know, they toured with Ozzy Osbourne, who, you know, he was definitely on the no-no list in the 80s, but he was also a household name. Everybody, even total normies and preps,
I knew who he was in grade school.
Yeah. So, I mean, he was super mainstream for what he was. So, Wicked Person says, artists work harder when they're hungry and trying to figure it out and reach an audience. And success means that flavor's gone now. Yeah. I mean, again, I'm not really here to give my opinion so much on whether Metallica's whatever.
Speak up. You're getting low in the voice. No, it's volume.
I know what you're saying, but geez. Anyway, yeah, it's not something that I'm gonna weigh in on, but yeah, I would agree with you in general that bands tend to be more interesting when they're hungry. Thus, stay hungry, as Dee Snider from Twisted Sister tried to tell us. And Jeffrey says, Melinda, what are your thoughts on rap music? Well, I mean, I'm not an expert on rap music, so, I mean, I think it's fine. I have certain rap bands that I enjoy and listen to from time to time, but I'm not nearly versed well enough to speak to any of that. Yeah, so I guess the big takeaways, I saw somebody mention earlier that, you know, those weren't tweets, those were Instagram posts. But either way, Metallica was getting in the fray with some rando fan trying to gatekeep. So I guess my point is if you see people gatekeeping, like, are they really gatekeeping? Are they keeping somebody from being able to listen to Metallica? No, it's just somebody like saying you're not cool on the internet. That's what that is. Certainly that happens all the time, right?
Yes.
So, yeah, I think King Eric says, has anyone ever seen the documentary about Anvil, a Canadian metal pioneer band? No, I have not. Melinda, what are your thoughts on power metal? You know, here's where I'm gonna talk about Stranger Things really quickly. And it's not spoilers. It's just my opinion. So I feel like Eddie's character should not have been playing Metallica, because Metallica fans back then were kind of like the most elitist, most, if you're going to say snooty, whatever, like they I'm sure that somebody out there is going to say, yeah, I was really into heavy metal and I played D&D, but that was not something I ever saw. People who played D&D were kind of like nerdy, and people who were into like metal enough that they were constantly wearing the metal outfit were not playing D&D. I feel like what would have been a much better musical choice for that scene, if you have to have that scene, would have been something like Dio or Iron Maiden, because their whole aesthetic really blends a whole lot better with what Eddie was all about. Whereas like a song about cocaine addiction seems very, very out of place. Like the absolute despair that comes with cocaine addiction is not really, you could have pulled all kinds of Iron Maiden songs, all kinds of power metal. Yeah. Just my 2 cents. Would have been a whole lot more believable. Although, where was the music coming from? Like, we're supposed to believe he's playing it, but like you hear the drums, you hear James Hetfield singing. I didn't see him put in a cassette tape. I'm just saying, it's a little weird. Matt Deckard says there is a difference between gatekeeping and schooling carpetbaggers. Well, yes, that's kind of what I was getting at earlier too. You can't just walk in the door as a new person and be like, "Hey, I'm every bit as, whatever as the rest of you here." So you're very quiet over there.
Mm-hmm.
Should speak up.
Nope.
Yeah, so Joel, yes, I have seen a lot of people have been talking about this. So the Paradise Lost thing with Damien Eccles and the West Memphis 3, a lot of parallels are being made to Eddie from that group. And so again, as Joel comments here, you should probably go check that out if you're interested in that. So yeah. I think that's pretty much all we have to say about that for tonight. So thank you all for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy whatever music you enjoy, and turn it all the way up to 10 and just enjoy the hell out of it, because no one can stop you from listening to whatever you want to listen to. That's really the bottom line here. So thanks, and we'll catch you next time.